So I take it always by the level, tone, and tenor of conversation in the room and out in the hall that things are going well. People's brains are being sparked, ideas are being generated. Bravo. Bravo to every single one of you. When you won't be quiet and sit down, I know things are going good. Thank you. Thank you for staying engaged. We're going to keep moving to a very special conversation that I think ties in the North American question that is so important to Ambassador Salazar. So the two gentlemen you see on stage in front of you, I want to introduce briefly, and then they will give comments. So I want to introduce Sylvain Fabi, Consul General of Canada, and the CEC Director, Daniel Taillant, who is also here as well. So Sylvain is the Consul General of Canada in Denver, where he works to enhance political, academic, and cultural links between Canada and the U.S. He was also Canada's chief negotiator for the modernization of the Columbia River Treaty with the United States. And Daniel and I had a conversation about glaciers, and I'll let him drop the stats on you. Daniel, tell me if I get this right. So 75% of the world's 75%, 98 is saltwater, 2% is freshwater. Of that 2%, 75% of the 2% is locked up in glaciers. So given my life and my time on glaciers and seeing them all over the world and all over the planet, he's written this incredible book called The Politics of Ice. And if you ever want an interesting read, boy, let me tell you, it's pretty spectacular. He's currently the executive director of the Commission for Environmental Cooperation and was the founder and executive director of the Center for Human Rights and Environment. Daniel has over 2 decades of experience in the area of environmental justice, human rights protection, corporate accountability, and climate change. So, Sylvain, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. It's once again a great pleasure to be here on the Spur campus, where I seem to be hanging around these days. I'll be back here next week, and that's I hope a proof that we have a good partnership, and that Spur is doing wonderful things, including completely modernizing a neighborhood that probably didn't look very nice before your buildings were built. But again, my name is Sylvain Fabi. I'm the Consul General of Canada. I think I've been introduced. My team supports Canada's engagement in 5 states, Colorado, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and Kansas, where we try to support our Canadian businesses doing business and investing in the territory. We represent our government in engagement with elected officials at all levels and undertake public diplomacy, as well as assist Canadian citizens in need. Of course, much of my role focuses on the economic relationship between Canada and the United States. We always like to give a little quick blurb on our bilateral relationship to put things in perspective. This economic relationship is extremely important to both of our countries. We're each other's biggest buyer of things. We are the biggest customer of the United States. And while not everything is about trade, I agree, I'll get to that, but you know, $2.5 billion worth of goods and services cross that border every single day. It is the largest bilateral relationship of all bilateral relationships in the world. So it's an important one. And we also stand together on the world stage, as you've seen in the recent past, and we are the closest of allies. And Colorado is a good place to exemplify that with our binational North American Defense Command at NORAD down the highway here in Colorado Springs. But of greatest importance to this symposium is the cooperation our two countries have on conservation and environmental issues. Before becoming Consul General here in Denver, I serve as Executive Director of the U.S. Transboundary Affairs Division at Global Affairs, our Department of Foreign Affairs. And what we did there is we managed border, energy, water, and other environmental issues affecting the Canada-US relationship. With a 5,000-mile border, there are a lot of things that happen around that border, 40% of which, by the way, is water. Not a lot of people know that. I didn't know that before I became director for that division. And as mentioned earlier, I also served from 2017 until last August, where I ran out of gas. I was also Canada's chief negotiator on the modernization of the Columbia River Treaty, where I dealt a lot with questions of ecosystem values and salmon restoration, trying to do perhaps the work that wasn't done in '64 when the treaty was signed. And a lot of the work we did hand in hand with Indigenous nations of Canada and also some tribal governments here in the US. Conservation is, of course, of the utmost importance to the Government of Canada. Canada's average temperatures are rising at twice the global average, and in the north, 3 times the global average. So we're concerned. Yeah? Up to 4. See, the expert is making sure I say the right thing. So our government has made fighting climate change one of our top priorities by enacting, price on carbon pollution, committing to a net zero electricity grid by 2035, and of course taking action on methane emissions as part of our global methane pledge. And just last year, as Mrs. Mallory earlier today mentioned, Canada hosted COP15 of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, where parties agrees to set ambitious key actions to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And the framework addresses the direct drivers of biodiversity loss and commits, as was said earlier, the global community by 2030 to at least halting and also reversing nature loss. Conserving 30% of land and oceans, which our government is trying to get there, and ensuring that at least 30% of the world's degraded ecosystems are under restoration. And as a large biodiversity-rich country, Canada is committed to implementing the framework and has started to develop a comprehensive and updated national biodiversity strategy in collaboration, of course, with our provinces, territories, Indigenous nations, who have a lot of knowledge and a lot of things to say to us on how to do that, and other key stakeholders. And as usual, if you promise to do something, you got to put some money in it, otherwise people won't believe you. So Canada made a $350 million commitment, which a US equivalent would be $3.5 billion. It's not insignificant money to support developing countries in implementing the same framework. But because these issues are talking about don't recognize international boundaries, it's key that countries like Canada and the US work hand in hand on conservation. The world's first ever environmental treaty, the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, was formed between our 2 countries. And we collaborate through numerous mechanisms across our federal, state, provincial, and local governments. And one of those examples is, of course, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. It is funded by Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It facilitates cooperation and public participation to conserve, protect, and enhance the North American environment for present and future generations. For that little boy sitting there who was making me beautiful smiles earlier today. Oh, he's looking at me now. There you go. Yeah. And one event that is a particular interest to me is a workshop the CEC is currently organizing with the Embassy of Canada in Mexico on traditional, I was just mentioning that, traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous engagement. And that brings me to introduce our guest today. It's my honor to introduce Jorge Taillant, Executive Director of the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. I had some words here, but my friend there mentioned them all, so that's good. I will say one thing about Daniel, on top of whatever you said, you can sum it up in one word. He is an EJ diplomat, environmental justice diplomat. So Daniel, thank you for being here, and over to you for your remarks and to speak about the CEC and your work.
Thank you very much. That was not the one, but There we go. That's just going to be up there while I speak, just so we remember what's going on. So when the EJ activist takes the microphone, then things change. We saw that a little earlier with our presentations. And when I was approached by the governing board of the CEC to take this job, because I didn't apply for it, I said, really, an EJ activist to run this organization? Well, it turns out, you know, Stephen Guilbeault used to climb on buildings in Canada, protesting, right?
You should tell them who he is. Some people don't.
He's a Minister of Environment of Canada, right? And Michael Regan, EPA, he's my other boss, and he's an EJ guy. And we see that in the Biden administration. And Albores, you know, community organizer from Mexico. So something's changing. I'm supposed to come up here and tell you about the CEC. That's what I got hired to do. But I take the mic and try to send messages more than to talk about our work. But we're working on air pollution. We're working on toxic chemicals, on transboundary issues involving migratory species, marine protected areas, circular economy, food lost and waste, big issue. We need to think about that. I think someone mentioned it earlier. Well, with the price of food these days, imagine going into the supermarket and buying 5 bags of groceries, and right when you walk out the door, throw away 3. That's what we do with our food loss and waste. So we're working on this as well, on EJ, on indigenous engagement, and traditional ecological knowledge, and on private sector engagement. That's all I'm going to say about the CEC. I'm going to come back to it a little later. So I have a few takeaway messages that I want to share with you. Some of these issues have come up, but I want to quote Teresa, who spoke a little earlier, not sure if she's here. She said something really important. We have to talk about what's uncomfortable. That really is the issue. And there are a lot of things that are uncomfortable, and we need to be able to engage on those. And I want to quote 2 individuals that spoke yesterday. The first is Gwen, who said something very important. She says, we need to deeply understand what is important to be understood. That is so critical. And then Lauren asked a question, and I want to ask the question alongside her, which is, are we doing the right thing? The short answer to that question is no. And that's what's uncomfortable about what we need to speak about, what we need to understand. We are not on the 1.5C pathway. And that suggests that no matter what you're doing, no matter what you think you're doing for climate change, no matter how great your programs are, it's not enough. Because if we're not on that pathway, we are headed towards ecological collapse. It's a staged collapse, and every 1/10 of a degree matters, and it brings on more human suffering. So whatever it is you think you're doing right, not enough. We have to do more. Let's do a little simple math. 1.5 is that threshold in the sand that we're not supposed to cross, where we're at 1.2. It only leaves 1.3. That's the uncomfortable thing we need to talk about. And we're moving quickly to 1.5. And that will trigger these irreparable, irreversible, and permanent damages. And most of society is talking about decarbonization and carbon neutrality by 2050. That's too late. You know, I asked that question yesterday in the carbon markets panel, and one of the panelists came up to me and said, that's not a question, is it? I said, no, it's not. If we're focused on decarbonization, I do want to distinguish between biodiversity protection and buildup from reducing carbon emissions. CO2 does not stop if we reduce it. If we focus on reducing CO2, it does not stop global warming. Not in the short term and before those tipping points hit. And certainly not before 2050. We need to decarbonize, don't get me wrong. We have to reduce CO2 emissions in the long term and immediately. But there are other things we have to do in order to slow warming, in order to stop the tipping points. And we're not doing all of them. And this is critical. And our metrics are wrong. And that goes back to the markets discussion. We all talk about GWP, global warming potential, and there's a little 100 underneath that. And some of you may or may not know what that means, but that's 100 years. And if we're measuring everything on 100-year scenarios, that's not enough. Going back to Lauren's question, we're not doing the right thing. We're measuring our emissions reductions and its influence in a 100-year framework. And we've only got a couple of years, maybe a decade, maybe 7 years, because, and I think Angel was the one that mentioned it earlier, 2030 is our limit and our framework of success. So if your carbon markets are pointing to a 100-year scenario about how we're going to get things right, it's not sufficient. And so I want to offer 3 solutions. 3 is always a good number. You can jot them down and walk away with them. Reducing super pollutants, it's methane that was already mentioned, black carbon, and HFCs, which are dirty refrigerants, and I'm going to get to those briefly. Avoided warming solutions or strategies, and the 3 Bs, which I call build back biodiversity. And that has to do with capturing the carbon that's in the atmosphere. And CO2, again, is a problem because once we've emitted it, it stays in the atmosphere, and it does so for hundreds of years. And that's why the resilient biodiversity, the building back that biodiversity is so important. But let's do the math on the short-lived pollutants, on the super pollutants. So methane is in 3 buckets. It's in energy, and we're wasting methane because we leak natural gas from production. And by the way, natural gas was never a bridge fuel. It was never cleaner than coal. Natural gas, and here is the problem with Peter's response to my question yesterday. He said, yeah, natural gas, 30 times worse than CO2. That's wrong. And it's wrong because, yes, 30, but in a 100-year scenario. Because if we measure methane in 10 years, it's 86 times worse than CO2. And so reducing 1 molecule of methane emissions is like 86 molecules of CO2. So back to the question, are we getting things right? Well, we're not if we're only focused on CO2, right? So methane is in energy, it's in waste. So your organic waste, those 3 bags of groceries you're throwing away without ever even opening them, is going, that organic waste is going to the landfills, and that generates methane. And it's in agriculture. And blue carbon, wow, 5 times more capture potential than land-based systems to capture CO2. I'm not saying that we should only focus on blue carbon, but if we're talking 2030, we need fast, powerful solutions now. And so methane in those 3 categories gives us 0.3 C, 0.3 degrees Celsius of avoided progress towards that 1.5. All right, so if the math is scary and we're almost there, I'm giving you 0.3 with methane to avoid getting there. The second one is black carbon, and that's happening from black carbon emissions. That's a fire in British Columbia. And that results in that, which we all saw in New York. That made it as far down as Washington, D.C. And that it results in this right here, which is scary. That's a glacier in British Columbia called the Conrad Glacier. And what you see is soot from the forest fires. And dark ice cover, so white ice reflects heat back into the atmosphere and into space. Dark cover on ice absorbs it. And that's why the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. When you melt those glaciers away and uncover darker surfaces, that heats up the ground, you capture heat, and then the next year, more melts and you capture more heat. That's that feedback loop. So this is happening with black carbon. And then finally, HFCs, the dirty refrigerants. It's in the AC, that's in this room right now, it's in your car, it's in the supermarket, it's in cold chain, it's in industry. These refrigerants can be up to thousands of times more potent than CO2. And we need to focus on reducing these pollutants because that's what's going to get us to cool the planet quickly. The second solution is the avoided warming strategies. And this has come up already. Put a dark surface on a glacier, it melts. Put a dark surface like a black tar roof on a building, especially in a poor neighborhood where they may not even have AC, or they may not be able to afford AC. On a 100-degree day, on the top of that roof, it's 160. That entire building is an oven, cooking people and cooking the environment. Now, if we put grass on the roof or paint it white, that's pretty simple, we reflect that heat. and by adding trees, shading, using more thermal construction materials. We can cool that building before we need to cool it. And that uses less energy and hopefully fossil fuels. So our math is wrong. Our focus is wrong. Our metrics are wrong. The third solution, we've mentioned it, and that's what this whole conference has been about, is building back our biodiversity. And so we need to think about all of the strategies that have been mentioned here and others to accelerate, to better capture CO2. I would love to say, and we're investing already in CO2 capture, but that's like taking a rocket out into outer space and not having the technology to land it when you get back. So maybe we'll figure it out like Apollo 13 did, but we may not. And so hopefully we will figure out ways to capture CO2 artificially, but in the meantime, this is the solution. Blue carbon is the solution. Building back our biodiversity is the solution. So last couple of thoughts. This is about to fall here. Let me just put it. There is a paradox in everything we do. I call it the intergenerational climate equity paradox. Sorry, long title. But the paradox is, and that goes back to the two quotes, are we doing the right thing? You can do all you want, but if you choose unwisely and resources are limited, we are condemning future generations to climate collapse and more suffering. So we don't have time to err at this point. Are we doing the right thing? Are we thinking about the urgency and the time frame? I don't think that we are. We say we are, but we have to make tough choices about where we invest our solutions. And so think about that. And the reality is we need to do this thinking about adaptation and communities that are most affected. And with an initiative like Justice 40 or other EJ initiatives, California that has written this into law, fantastic. But we need to balance. So we can produce solutions like shading in poor neighborhoods so that people have EJ solutions and at the same time are working on mitigation. We don't have unlimited funds to engage with. And I'm going to say something about youth because many people have talked about youth. And youth is extremely important in this equation. But I think we, our generation, the people in charge today, need to take some responsibility, right? So I've heard the comment, you know, my nature is not your solution. Well, I want to hear the young people telling us, you know, my youth is not your solution. We need to fix this problem now and not give the burden to the future generations, because by the time youth today are in the power that we're in, it's too late. So what you're telling youth is, by not doing the right thing, you're going to have to deal with the problem. And that's certainly not acceptable. Science is difficult, but science has known what to do for a long time. And unfortunately, politics gets in the way sometimes of science. Crazy that the IPCC, the climate science, and the IPBES, the biodiversity science, never really talked to each other until recently. They produced a report. And then from that to go to policy, and then to planning, and then to finance, and then to action, that takes time. We don't have time. We have to act quickly. And so I'm going to close by changing around a little bit of what Crystal said when she was talking about nature-based solutions having to be part of our DNA. Well, the urgency of climate change needs to be part of our DNA. And that is for everyone. It's not only for those that are not on board yet, it's also for the EJ communities. It's for the academics, it's for the scientists, it's for the industries, it's for the oil industry, it's for anyone working on climate change. We need to understand that what we are doing right now is not enough, and we need to do more. Thank you.
Good job, man.
Well, thank you, Danielle. Pretty inspiring stuff, although when things are inspiring, they don't necessarily make you feel better. But I guess it's important in the context of what we're facing for the future. I have some questions here. I'm pretty happy about the questions that came up. They make me feel good because in case no questions would come from the audience, I had my team and I, we prepared some questions, and your questions are quite similar to what we had thought. So it makes me feel that maybe we were at least half right. And again, I'm going to try to choose from the questions. We're probably not going to have time to ask them all, but nevertheless, we'll go from here. Okay, so a little bit about the CEC, right? Just quickly, I'm not going to have all the questions about it, but do you feel that the leadership at the CEC, which basically goes all the way up to the governments, is actually supportive of your goals around environmental justice, climate, and biodiversity? Or do you get pushback from the three governments?
Great question. But that's kind of what I started with when I said that I was called out and I was asked to join the CEC as director. It's not something I applied for. And I was clear about that question. Are you going to support this urgency, which is my agenda? It's what I've been working on, the EJ agenda. And the answer was yes. And I have been supported, and we have been supported. We didn't have a short-lived pollutant project, and I proposed one first day. There was a little pushback, but we just announced one at our recent Victoria ministerial meeting. We're doing a new cycle of our EJ grants work, pushing for Indigenous engagement. We just hired a new Indigenous and traditional ecological officer to join us. He's a young Cree leader in Canada, and we're doing great things on TK. We're all part of this. And the three countries, I must say, they were founding members of the creation of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is a coalition working on the super pollutants. Through the North American Leader Summits, they're making very big commitments to engage on disaster risk, on early warning systems, on methane waste. The climate emergency is front and center. And they've asked me, and that's part of my mandate, to get out and talk about the CEC and engage. That's why I'm here. Might not have happened under the former directors. There wasn't all that much engagement regionally to tell the story of what we're doing. And we have 3 decades of experience on mapping pollutants and on collaborative projects and working with the embassies across the 3 countries and local communities. It is moving. And I mentioned it earlier, the 3 governing board members come from very mobile, very activist, very loud voices in society calling for change. So I'm confident we're headed in the right direction.
Thank you, Daniel. A little bit related to that, that seems to be the most popular question. That little app is pretty good. When you like a question, it moves up. So we have to be careful, because I may want to ask a question and then disappears because people don't like it. But the first one is, as you mentioned, we don't have a lot of time, and change moves at the speed of trust, right? So how do we speed up trust across the 3 countries? And I would put my flavor on it, amongst all countries.
Well, we have to have those difficult conversations. We have to talk about what we're not comfortable talking about. And once you start doing that, as an EJ activist in South America, we used to throw rocks at the government and tell them they were doing everything wrong. The moment you sit down with the public officials and you try to iron out your strategies and your programs, things start changing. You all of a sudden know people. I really respected the way that our EJ, or the community leaders earlier, started their conversation talking about their family. When you put humanity to people's faces, when you start to talk about conversations, when you know someone, harder to throw a rock at them, right? And that's when you start engaging. And if we're not consulting, if we're not engaging, if we're not bringing people to the table, it's easier for politics and policy not to move in the right direction. So we need to better engage. And I think there's a lot of advance in all 3 countries about how we engage, about putting communities at the forefront and leading processes of change. That has to be balanced with education. You can't expect any community to know what to do if it doesn't have the proper information. If we go back to Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, that was, 20 years ago, a basic element of that is having information and being able to participate. We can't participate if we don't have knowledge, so access to information is key. We need education, but we need communities to be able to engage and mark their own pathway in an informed way.
Thanks again. Another question that seems to be popular, could you say something about the climate impact due to growth of electrical energy demand from AI, crypto, and data centers?
Wow. Let's go with AI a little bit because
Good crowd. I mean,
yeah, that's good. So yeah, data centers are a big problem, but I want to talk about AI because that seems to be what everyone's talking about. And I just want to put a red flag on AI, right? AI is not intelligent. Sorry. It's the sum of our knowledge. It's what we know processed more quickly. But we're getting it wrong. So there's an inherent conflict there. AI is going to be processing our collective knowledge, and collectively we're screwing up. And so how can we expect AI to be more intelligent than we are, right?
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. So
In some sectors, like in
Yes.
things like health, that could be positive.
I get you there, but and I'm not against AI, but I think we need to be careful. And where is information coming from? Global North, right? So you don't have a lot of information from the Global South because a lot of it doesn't exist, or it's not in a database, or it hasn't been captured. And so it's punching out, it's producing, it's regurgitating what it has, and what it has is oftentimes very one-sided. So just be careful about where and how we use AI.
I just want to say a little something about that question. I was at an industrial challenge yesterday, oil and gas, clean technologies, right? It sounds like an oxymoron, but just bear with me. And one small company came up with a system that, and you'll see where I'm getting at, just bear with me. A system that, you know, when you push gas through a pipeline, you have to pressure it, right? So you need energy. And then, but at the other end, when the gas is about to be used, you have to very significantly depressurize. What happens? All goes up in the air. That's carbon, right? So since we kind of agree that while we have to seriously reduce the bad things we do, we're probably going to be using at least gas for a little while longer, right? So the company, what they do is they put a system that when you depressurize the gas, you use energy. That energy, instead of sending it up in the air, you produce energy with it, and you use that energy. And now what's been happening is small data center, this is where I was going, small data centers are going to be installed in these places. They're not big buildings, contrary to what some people, I mean, many of them are not. So the data centers can use that energy to power themselves, and all that big bad heat that comes out is captured, transformed into energy through this system. It's a virtuous circle. So the solution may not be not to do data centers, but it's to do them better. So I thought I'd just share that with you because I was pretty impressed by that technology, which, by the way, is fairly simple. It's amazing to think that no one's thought about it before. It was thought about it before, but they couldn't do it in an economic way. Now because you know, you can be all for doing something right, but if you're going to lose your shirt doing it, you won't do it. So now it's economically feasible. So I thought it was an interesting thing. Another question that made it up to the top is, are the older generations really ready to have those uncomfortable conversations, do you think, with the youth, for that matter, to really get things done?
Well, we have to, you know, there's no plan B. And so we have to have the conversations. I used to be a rock thrower. Now I'm a diplomat trying to handle those rocks coming in. but we have to have the conversations. I wrote a paper recently with a very young woman, she's 20 at the time, about COVID and why we mobilize globally for COVID, but we don't mobilize for climate in the same way. And it has to do with the urgency of the problem and how we perceive it. I think things are changing and we do perceive climate as more urgent. But the one lesson I take from COVID that gives me hope for the younger generation and for solutions is that, we used to think we couldn't stop those emissions. We couldn't stop black carbon. We couldn't stop the CO2 because it's just antithetical to the way we are in our economies and our industries. But the reality is in 2-3 weeks, we stopped everything. And people that lived at the foot of the Himalayas or 100 kilometers away saw the mountains for the first time because of black carbon. We stopped black carbon. And there's a big lesson there. In a couple of weeks, we solved a huge problem. And that goes back to our super pollutants, the ones we need to reduce. So we can do this. We just need to understand that we have to act to do it. We have to move from the science and to the front and the opportunity to actually doing it. The younger generation has learned that you can do it if you just do it, right? It's kind of like the Nike commercial.
And there are things that were done successfully, and I often think that we're not trying to follow these examples. One of the best thing ever done for the environment in the past was the solution for ozone, right?
Mario Molina, he's a Nobel Prize scientist from Mexico, and he was one of the ones that realized that fixing the ozone problem slowed climate change by a decade. And he was part of the group of scientists that came to the forefront in 2006, 2007, talking about the super pollutants. Well, it took us all this time to get to a global methane pledge, which happened in Glasgow 2 years ago. So that's how long the science took to become policy, and now we're starting to implement methane reduction strategies.
Yeah, but it's an example that things can be done. Will they be done fast enough? I can't answer that, but I'm with you when you say that we actually can do it. We
Not
have
that hard.
so many tools we can use, right? And if you add them all up, it'll work. And I'm glad you mentioned that while obviously carbon emissions are very bad, it's not the only thing, right? So if we just concentrate on it,
The base, it has to happen.
it has to happen.
Right.
But so many other things we can do along with it to
Have
speed
to
it
happen.
up. Yeah, like methane. Okay. Well, Danielle, thank you so much for your wisdom, your enthusiasm, your energy, which I like. This is an important issue, and I'm glad you're at the helm of that organization to make sure that you keep those government in line. Thank you.